Myra always dreamed of adventure. At 28, her life as a graphic designer in London felt boring. 9 months ago, she met John on a travel forum. His post showed picture of rural Africa, where he lived. They started chatting a lot, sharing dreams and stories. John was charming, and his promises to show Myra the real Africa made her decide to meet him. When Myra stepped off the plane, the Africa scent felt warm and welcoming. John was at the arrivals gate holding a handmade sign with her name. He was tall, confident, and friendly. They hugged awkwardly at first, but the connection they had only made it easier. John village was 2 hours away by the car. As they drove, the busy city gave way to a wide, open savanna. Maira was amazed by the beauty of the land. Trees, animals grazing in the distance, and children playing near mud houses. "You are going to love my village," John said. "It's simple but full of tradition." When they got to the village, the people gathered to welcome her. Women in bright clothes sang songs, and children peeked from behind their mothers. John introduced her to his family, his father, his mother, and his nephew Brian. The village felt warm and friendly, and Myra started to feel at ease. That evening, a big meal was made in her honor. The smell of roasted goat and spices filled the air. Myra's plate was full, and John's family encouraged her to eat. She felt special and cared for, but later Myra noticed something strange. The villagers' smiles seemed to fade when they thought she wasn't looking. Conversation in the local language quitted when she got close. Myra thought maybe it was just a cultural difference, or that she was imagining things. The next morning, Myra woke up early and decided to explore the village while John worked. She walked past the huts, greeting people with her small knowledge of their language. Most people were polite, but some of them looked at her strangely. Brian, the young nephew, followed her whenever she went. "Do you want to play?" Myra asked. Kneeling down, he shook his head, staring at her with concern. Later, Myra overheard 2 women talking while sitting under a tree. She couldn't understand what they said, but their glances toward her made her uneasy. When she told John, he said it was nothing, that you just curious about you. He said with a smile, "You are the first foreigner to visit." That night, Myra had trouble sleeping. The village had been full of life during the day, was eerily quiet, even the usual sound of insects seemed gone. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next evening, Myra noticed John acting strangely. He wasn't paying much attention to her, and his responses were short. His parent, who had been kind before, also seemed to avoid her. Brian came to Myra after dinner. "Don't drink it," he whispered, pointing to the cup of traditional drink in her hand. His small hand shook as he pulled at her sleeve. "What do you mean?" Myra asked softly. Brian looked around nervously. "Just don't." Confused, Myra pretended to drink, but secretly poured it into the sand. She wanted to ask John later, but he was busy talking to the villager leaders. That night, Myra lay awake, thinking about the strange things happening. Why was John acting distant? What was Brian trying to warn her about? Myra decided she would leave the next day, but since she had no way to leave on her own, she would need John's help. Early the next morning, Myra overheard John and his father arguing. She couldn't understand their words, but the anger in their voices was clear. When Myra asked John about it, he didn't explain. "Family matters," he said. As the day went on, the villagers avoided Myra. The friendly greetings and curious looks were replaced with cold stares and whispers. Even the children kept their distance, only Brian stayed close, his face full of worry. Brian, what's going on? Myra asked, kneeling to talk to him. He hesitated before answering. They are going to take you, he whispered. Myra's heart skipped a beat. Take me where? Brian shook his head and started to cry. You have to run, he said. Tonight. Myra tried to act normal the rest of the day, but her mind was racing. She packed a small bag, feeling scared and unsure. That evening during dinner, she noticed that John was watching her closely. His eyes were cold now, not warm like before. Myra pretended to be tired and excused herself early. She waited until the village was quiet before sneaking out. Brian was waiting for her near the edge of the village. This way, he whispered, leading her toward the forest. As they moved through the thick trees, Brian told her in broken English, Every year, the village gives a sacrifice to the gods. They believed it bring good crops, a good life. Myra's heart sank. And this year I am the sacrifice? She asked quietly. Brian nodded. John chose you. He said you love him, so you won't run. Myra felt betrayed. She had trusted John, traveled all this way to be with him, and now he was going to use her for a cruel ritual. They reached a river, its cold water glowing to the moonlight. You have to cross, Brian said. They won't follow. Myra hesitated. The current was strong, and she wasn't a good swimmer, but hearing voices in the distance made her decided to go. She hugged Brian tightly. Thank you, she whispered, then stepped into the cold water. The current was stronger than she thought, and several times she thought she might be swept away, but fear kept her going. When she finally reached the other side, she collapsed on the bank, gasping for breath. She looked back and saw Brian on the other side, his figure lit by the moon. He waved and disappeared into the trees. Myra walked through the forest, her wet clothes streaking to her. Every sound made her jump, but she kept going. After what felt like hours, she saw a light in the distance. She followed it and came to a small church. The priest, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked at her. Without asking question, he gave her dry clothes and a warm meal while she told him and what happened. You are safe, he said. The villagers won't come near to the church. Back in the village, the elders were angry. When they found out Myra was gone, they couldn't do the ritual without her. John, desperate to please the god, offered himself instead. The elders agreed, and John faced the ritual he had planned for Myra. Days later, Myra contacted the authorities with the priest's help. Though they didn't fully believe her, they went to investigate. When they arrived, the village was empty, the houses were abandoned, and the fields were overgrown, as if the villager had left suddenly. Myra returned to London, changed by everything that happened. The betrayal hurt, but Brian's bravery gave her hope. She often wondered what happened to him and the villagers, but one thing was clear: she would never let her guard down.